When Banu Nadir were expelled from their land, they took their camels and marched to the fertile oasis of Khaybar. It was an area the Jewish tribes had already fortified with settlements and strongholds, and it wasn't far from the orchards in Medina, valuable lands they still hoped to reclaim. Immediately, the leaders of Banu Nadir set out on a diplomatic mission to Mecca, offering to give the starving Meccan economy all the financial support it needed. The Meccans, they agreed, and together they formed an alliance. And soon they convinced the leaders of Banu Ghatafan as well, a large northern tribe known for its fierce and ruthless fighters. These three major groups formed the Ahzab, the Confederates, and several other tribes soon joined them. It was now a united front against the Muslims, a massive force of 10,000 men, unprecedented in all of Arabian history. Never before had such a large confederation of tribes joined forces, and now they were marching towards Medina. The Muslims soon heard of this enormous army approaching, at least 4 times the size of any force they could gather. Fear and doubt spread quickly. They were sitting ducks. There was nothing they could do. The end of the Muslim ummah had come. Never before had such a mighty force been defeated on the battlefield. Then an old man from a faraway land stepped forward and came to the Prophet ﷺ. He belonged to a people who had withstood the might of the Roman Empire, defending themselves century after century and remaining unconquered for the last 800 years. What he proposed was nothing short of genius, a simple idea that could save the Muslims. But if they were to act on his plan, they had to begin immediately. The window of opportunity was closing fast as the enemies of Islam drew closer each day. The Prophet ﷺ agreed, and it was decided. The Muslims set to work building the defense that he suggested. Salman was the beloved son of a Zoroastrian priest from the Persian city of Isfahan. They were a people who may have once had a prophet and had originally worshipped Allah, but had since deviated into fire worship. Salman himself became the custodian of the sacred fire, which had to be protected from the elements and could never be extinguished. One day, he passed by an Ebionite church, the last remnants of the followers of Isa ﷺ and his Khalifa, James. These Christians believed that Isa ﷺ was only a man and a messenger, and they rejected Paul, whom they considered a false prophet. They had been forced to flee the Roman Empire because they refused to believe in the Trinity or to say that Isa ﷺ was the son of Allah. Passing by and listening to their prayers, Salman was deeply moved by what he heard. Soon he decided to abandon fire worship and join their faith. His father, enraged, shackled him inside their home. Realizing that his father would never accept his choice, Salman eventually freed himself and left home. He joined a Christian caravan and traveled to the lands of Syria. There he moved from priest to priest, living and learning with them until each one passed away. Decades rolled by and Salman grew old in their service. Finally, the last of these priests lay on his deathbed. Salman asked where he should go next, for the Ebionite Christians had all but died out and their communities had faded away. That was when the dying priest told Salman something remarkable. "Oh, my son, I do not know of anyone who follows our way to whom I can advise you to go. But there has come the time of a prophet who will be sent with the pure religion of Ibrahim. He will migrate to the place of palm trees. If you can be sincere to him, then do so. He has 3 signs which you will recognize. 1, he does not consume charity. 2, he accepts gifts. 3, between his shoulders he has the seal of prophethood." A caravan passed by later that day and Salman joined it, heading for the lands of Arabia. But when they reached their destination, they deceived him. He was captured, enslaved, and eventually sold to a man from the Jewish tribe of Banu Quraydha in the city of Yathrib. This was the very place of palm trees that the dying priest had foretold, and it was where the mountain of Salah stood, a mountain mentioned in the Bible as the place where the next prophet was to appear. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. He will not falter or be discouraged until he establishes justice on earth. Let the settlements where Kedar lives rejoice. Let the people of Selah sing for joy. Soon Salman began to hear rumors that a man from Mecca had arrived in the city, claiming to be a prophet. Excited by the news, Salman waited for his master to fall asleep, and in the middle of the night he slipped out of the house and went to find this new prophet. He brought some food as charity for him and his companions, but the Prophet ﷺ told the others to eat while he himself refrained. He did not consume charity. The next day, Salman returned and brought more food, this time calling it a gift. The Prophet ﷺ accepted the food and ate with him, confirming the second sign this priest had mentioned. He accepts gifts. Finally, there was the seal of prophethood, a small raised mark between the prophet's shoulders, described as the size of a dove's egg or like the button of a bridal canopy. The priest had mentioned this as the third and final sign, and Salman moved behind the Prophet ﷺ looking for it. And understanding what he was seeking, the Prophet lowered his garments from his shoulders, and Salman saw the seal with his own eyes. Muhammad ﷺ was in the right land at the right time, fulfilling all three signs. So Salman took the Shahada, testifying that only Allah is to be worshipped and that Muhammad ﷺ is his servant and messenger. The battles of Badr and then Uhud passed, and each time Salman longed to join the Muslims in combat, but as a slave, he was bound to his master. Eventually, the Prophet ﷺ helped him purchase his freedom, and Salman was finally able to join the Muslim army and offer his strategic advice. Whenever the Persians were under attack, he explained, they would take up their shovels and dig a trench. Medina was surrounded by lava fields to the east and west, and by large date plantations to the south. This made it very difficult for an army to attack the city from those three directions, leaving only the north as a viable point of invasion. So the Muslims decided to dig a trench across the northern side of the city, making it impossible for an enemy force to simply march in and conquer. The Muslims divided themselves into teams of 10, and the Prophet ﷺ joined them, digging with his own two hands. For the next 6 days, they worked without rest, laboring under the scorching sun by day and enduring the bitter cold of the winter nights. The fear they felt was known only to Allah, for they were well aware that the enemies of Islam were already on their way.
إذ جاءوكم من فوقكم ومن أسفل منكم وإذ زاغت الأبصار وبلغت القلوب الحناجر وتظنون بالله الظنونا.
When the trench was finished, it was too wide to jump across and deep enough to prevent anyone from climbing out easily. It stretched for several kilometers in length. By now, the army of 10,000 had arrived on the far side of the trench, and the Prophet ﷺ ordered that all the women and children be taken to one of the city's fortresses. The Muslims then camped just behind that trench with Medina at their backs and prepared for what could be their final battle. Then something unexpected happened. The second largest tribe in the Confederation, Banu Ghatafan, sent a delegation to the Prophet ﷺ and spoke of the deal they had made with Banu Nadir. Banu Nadir had promised them half of the next harvest in Khaybar if they had joined their army. It was indeed a fortune, but in reality, Banu Ghatafan had little desire to fight. So they proposed that the Prophet ﷺ give them 1/3 of Medina's next harvest, and in return, they would simply withdraw. At first, the Prophet ﷺ considered the idea and discussed it with the Muslims, but Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh and Sa'ad ibn Ubaidah, the two leaders of Aus and Khazraj, they went to the Prophet ﷺ and they said, "We have never humiliated ourselves in Jahiliyyah, so why should we humiliate ourselves in Islam?" At this, the Prophet ﷺ rejected their offer, and Banu Ghatafan began their preparations for war. Medina was now under siege. The trench was divided into sections where Muslims took turns guarding and watching, standing for long hours through the cold, sleepless nights. Other groups were assigned to patrol the entire length of the trench, calling out, Allahu Akbar, to deceive the enemies into thinking that they were greater in number. For a month, they lived like this, always on high alert, waiting and watching to see if anyone would dare cross the trench. In the bitter winter, food grew scarce and people began to starve. From time to time, small enemy groups tried to cross, but each time the Muslims counterattacked and drove them back. Then one man managed to slip across the trench, making his way into Medina under the cover of night. He was the leader of Banu Nadir, and he went straight to Banu Quraydha, his fellow Jewish tribe who were still in their fortresses within the city. There, he promised them wealth and land if they would attack the Muslims from behind. Eventually, Banu Quraydha agreed, and they began preparing for war until one of the Muslims discovered their plot. Zubair ibn al-Awwam hurried back to the Prophet ﷺ and reported what he had seen. The Prophet then sent a delegation of 4 men to speak with Banu Quraydha. When they asked about their treaty, Banu Quraydha replied, "Who is this messenger of Allah that you say? We don't know of any Muhammad and we don't have any treaty with him." It was now clear. Banu Quraydha had switched sides. There had been 10,000 enemies on the outside, and now there were 2,000 more on the inside. The already small Muslim patrols were forced to split in 2 to watch both the front and the rear. A small contingent of soldiers was sent to guard the women and children who were now completely exposed. The siege had dragged on for a month and the situation grew increasingly dire. Food was almost gone, supplies were dwindling, and the Muslim army was stretched to its limits. And the soldiers were on the brink of collapse. And on top of this, the munafiqun continually sapped the morale, asking for permission to abandon their posts and return to their homes. They said, "Here was Muhammad promising us the treasures of Persia and Rome. And now one of us is too scared to even go defecate." And that's when Allah sent help from a place they never expected. A man by the name of Nu'aym ibn Mas'ud entered the camp of the Prophet ﷺ and said, "I have accepted Islam, so tell me to do whatever you want." He was a businessman from the tribe of Banu Ghatafan and personally knew the leaders of both the Quraysh and Banu Quraydha. That night, he went to Banu Quraydha, the internal enemy in Medina, and began sowing suspicion in their hearts. He reminded them that their homes and their families were in the city, while Quraysh could always retreat and go back to Mecca. So if they were to form an alliance with the Quraysh, he advised them to take 70 of their noblemen as hostages in case the Quraysh betrayed them. The next morning, Nu'aym went to the Quraysh and planted doubts in their minds as well. He told them that Banu Quraydha were thinking of backing out of the alliance and were planning to seize 70 Qurayshi noblemen to hand over to Muhammad ﷺ as part of a secret deal. He warned them, if Banu Quraydha come asking for their nobles, consider it a sign of treachery. Nu'aym then returned to his own tribe and said, the Quraysh have no real interest in continuing this war, and Banu Quraydha have switched sides. If they come asking for 70 of our noblemen, know that they will hand them over to Muhammad ﷺ to seek forgiveness for betraying him. Sure enough, Banu Quraydha soon asked both the Quraysh and Banu Ghatafan for 70 noblemen, just as Nu'aym had suggested. Suspicion immediately flared on every side. The once unified confederation began to unravel. The Quraysh accused Banu Quraydha of treachery, saying that those 70 men would end up in Muhammad ﷺ's hands. Banu Quraydha panicked, accusing Quraysh of betraying instead. The Quraysh, now impatient, weary of delay, they declared that they would attack the next day. But they made this decision on a Friday, and the following day was the Sabbath, a day on which the Jews were forbidden to work or fight. So Banu Quraydha asked for a 1-day delay and still insisted on the 70 hostages. This only deepened Qurayshi suspicion. Many of them had never even heard of the Sabbath and imagined instead that Banu Qurayza needed an extra day to help Muhammad ﷺ prepare his defenses. And then came the storm. That night, as the enemies of Islam sat in their tents, thunder clouds gathered and fierce winds howled across the plain. A wall of freezing sand and dust swept through the camps, pelting the skins like 1,000 needles, choking their mouths and noses, burning their throats and lungs. Every breath felt like inhaling sandpaper. Fires were extinguished, and the vast army was plunged into icy darkness. Panic spread. They could barely breathe, shout, or even see their own hands in front of them. Already torn by mutual suspicion, the Confederate tribes now fell apart entirely under the fury of the storm. The Quraysh were the first to retreat, and one by one the rest followed, each tribe slipping away into the night.
يا أيها الذين آمنوا اذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ جاءتكم جنود فأرسلنا عليهم ريحا وجنودا لم تروها وكان الله بما تعملون بصيرا.
The Battle of Khandaq was a humiliating defeat for the Quraysh. Never before had such a massive army been raised in Arabia, yet they still failed to defeat the Muslims. The tide was now turning among the Arabs. Poetry quickly spread news of the Muslims' victories, and the message of the Prophet ﷺ was rapidly becoming known across the Arabian Peninsula. When the Muslims left their camps the next morning, they found the entire battlefield deserted. All the enemy tents had been blown over and scattered by the wind, and not a single soul from the Confederation remained. Slowly, the Muslims emerged from their positions, making their way back into the city. But the Prophet ﷺ knew that the battle was not yet over. He sent a messenger to run through the streets with an urgent announcement to the people. Whoever hears must obey, and nobody is allowed to pray Asr except at Banu Quraydha. This was an urgent call. They were not to return home or lay down their armor, not while an enemy still remained among them. Quickly, the Muslims gathered what little strength they had left, and they rushed to the far edge of the city. There, they set up new camps surrounding the fortress, and they began preparing for another siege. Days turned into weeks as the Muslims maintained that siege, until Banu Quraydha grew desperate. They sent messengers to the Prophet ﷺ begging to be released, but the betrayal had been too grave. The Prophet ﷺ refused anything short of unconditional surrender. After 24 days, Banu Quraydha were hungry and exhausted, and they decided they would surrender the next morning. But in the middle of the night, one man slipped out to the front gate, an honest man who had been the only one in the tribe to oppose the treacherous plots of the others. He said, "I will never betray the promise of Muhammad." The Muslim guarding the gate saw him, and knowing his honesty, allowed him to leave. The man slipped out of Medina and disappeared into the night, and no one knows what became of him afterwards. When the Prophet ﷺ heard what had happened, he said, "That was a man whom Allah saved because of his honesty." The next morning, Banu Quraydha emerged from their fortress and surrendered on the condition that Sa'd ibn Mu'adh would decide their fate. He was the leader of the tribe of Aus, their longtime allies before Islam. Throughout the siege, the people of Aus had begged the Prophet ﷺ to be lenient towards them, just as he had been towards Banu Nadir before. But what Banu Quraydha had done was on a completely different level, a betrayal unmatched by any other. Because of them, every Muslim man, woman, and child had been on the brink of slaughter. They had sworn 3 separate oaths to Muhammad ﷺ to uphold the constitution of Medina, yet they were the ones who opened the door to let the enemy in. And yet, despite all of this, the Prophet ﷺ stepped back and he allowed Sa'd ibn Mu'adh to decide their fate. At this, Banu Quraydha were overjoyed, hoping their longtime ally would bail them out once again. People rushed to find him, but he had been gravely wounded while fighting at the trench and was now at death's door. Still, he agreed, and they carried him to the fortress, pleading with him along the way to show mercy and let Banu Quraydha go. But he replied, now is the time for Sa'ad not to care about the criticisms of any critic when it comes to Allah and His Messenger. It was clear he had already made his decision. He arrived at the fortress, and the Prophet ﷺ told the tribe of Aus, stand up to greet your leader. He then turned to Sa'ad and said, your people, Banu Aus, have accepted you as the judge of these men, Banu Quraydha. Sa'ad then asked his people, I call you to Allah. Will you listen and obey me in whatever verdict I give? They answered yes. He turned to the Prophet ﷺ and lowered his face before him. And you as well, Ya Rasulullah? The Prophet ﷺ said, yes. So Sa'ad declared, my judgment for them is that their men should be executed, their property distributed, and their women and children taken as captives. The Prophet then said, Wallahi, Ya Sa'ad, you have decreed upon them the judgment of Allah from above the seven heavens. This was the sad story of Banu Quraydha. It didn't have to end this way. Most books you'll find on Islamic history are extremely bland and boring and often hard to read. And so that's why I've paid special attention to the storytelling in the book that I'm writing called The Entire History of Islam. Islamic history is full of emotional moments, from the glory the Muslims would have felt that day when they conquered Constantinople to the great misery and fear that they felt when the Mongols invaded their lands. These were moments of joy and jubilation, and these were moments of extreme sadness and depression. Heroes that brought victory and justice to the land, and villains that massacred the people and brought destruction to their people. And when we read through these stories, we need to understand the emotions that they were going through as well. We need to understand the fear that Umar ibn al-Khattab had when he was given responsibility over the ummah. No longer did he have the Prophet ﷺ who was receiving direct revelation from Allah. He was on his own with the weight of the world on his hands. And we need to understand the joy and the jubilation that those Muslims would have felt as they finally liberated the city of Jerusalem after 100 years in the hands of the Crusaders. This is what I've been trying to bring the ummah over the last 5 years with my videos on TikTok and YouTube. I've written hundreds of stories about the Muslim ummah, and I will be applying those same storytelling techniques that I've learned over those years to this book, so that when you read this book, you too will feel what your ancestors felt as they were overcoming the most dire of circumstances. So go to my website now and pre-order the book. And I will literally write your name into the book, an honor for you, because you were one of the very first people to support this project. Something special for the people only who pre-ordered this book during this Ramadan. Throughout the vast majority of history, treason was understood to be one of the greatest crimes a person could commit. And it was a standard practice around the world for traitors to be executed, especially during times of war. For example, in ancient Rome, traitors were often beheaded by the state, with many also undergoing a civil death to erase their existence from history. Their lands and their wealth were confiscated, their presence was removed from all government records, and people were forced to forget them and move on, prohibited from even mentioning their name. In another example, in medieval and early modern England, traitors were met with even more gruesome punishments. Men were hanged, drawn, and quartered, while women were burned at the stake. These punishments were carried out in public with the intention of terrifying the people and preventing others from committing the same crimes. Execution for traitors continued even as recently as World War II. Two famous examples can be seen when Britain ordered the execution of John Amory in 1945 and William Lord Haha Joyce in 1946 for spreading Nazi propaganda and collaborating with the Axis powers. These executions were normal for their times, and they were seen as righteous and moral acts by the people around the world. It's only in the post-World War II era that modern Western countries began to shun capital punishment as a whole, though some countries, such as France, Germany, and Spain, continued executions all the way up into the late 70s and early 80s. While most crimes are limited to attacks on individual people or their personal wealth or property, treason is considerably worse because it attacks an entire civilization as a whole. In the case of war, the defending party faces the gravest consequences if they fail to win. They may be killed and tortured, their women and children may be violated in unspeakable ways, and their society, their civilization, may be erased from the map, never to be remembered again. This is especially clear in the Arabs' war on Islam, as the mushrikun were not only trying to massacre the Prophet ﷺ and every other Muslim in Medina, but they were trying to erase the existence of Islam and the true religion of Allah. Then there is the added level of a fiduciary breach in the treaty, a concept in which people in positions that require great trust are also burdened with enormous responsibility. This is a well-established concept in all societies. Doctors are fiduciaries of their patients. Preschool teachers are fiduciaries of the children in their care. If any of these people breach their trust and harm those that they are responsible for, the consequences are far greater due to the sanctity of the relationship they have violated. In the case of Banu Quraydha, they swore to protect Medina and the Muslims on 3 separate occasions, assuring the Muslims of their commitment and trustworthiness. They were the fiduciaries of the Muslims, but in the end, they broke that trust. Their attack on the Muslims was therefore far worse than that of a clear enemy.
ولا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى.
In Islam, everyone is responsible for their own sins, and no one is punished for the sins of anyone else. But if this is the case, then why does it seem that the entire tribe of Banu Quraydha was punished for the crime of their leaders? Well, you see, in modern times, nation-states have militaries with paid soldiers separate from the civilian populations. They also have clear leaders within a hierarchy, military generals and commanders, as well as individual rulers of the nation as a whole. There are clear lines of responsibility for crimes committed, and leaders and soldiers can be punished individually for these crimes, while civilian populations are free from blame as they're innocent of what the militaries have done. However, this was not the case in ancient Arabia, where most of the peninsula was made up of small tribes scattered across the desert. There were no formal militaries or distinctions between soldiers and civilians. Leadership was also not in the hands of one king or emperor, and there were no war cabinets of military leaders deciding whether to go to war or not. Rather, decisions were made through assemblies of tribal elders known as the Majlis, with all adult men of fighting age participating in collective decision-making. This meant that adult men were considered a single political unit, both responsible for carrying out the betrayal and legally liable for treason. This decision was not made by a tiny inner circle of men. Rather, the tribe as a collective whole had to agree to the betrayal. But because only adult men were responsible for the decision, they were the only ones executed for treason, while women and children were taken captive instead. Societies are founded on bonds of trust between people. And if people lose trust in one another, the whole system can collapse and fall into anarchy. This will then lead to oppression of the weak, and major corruption and violations of people's rights will plague the land. But after such an existential betrayal, the people of Medina would have begun to suspect one another, and the entire Muslim state could have easily fallen apart. It had only been a few years since the people had adopted Islam, and when a society makes such enormous changes in such a short period of time, there is usually a backlash, and people eventually revert back to their old ways. It was now absolutely vital that the Prophet ﷺ restore the bonds of trust between the people, and to do that, he needed to reassure the people that justice would be preserved. If such a severe crime did not receive a severe punishment, then discontent would remain in society. With all the internal pressures from within and the external pressures from outside, there was a very high likelihood that Medina would fall apart and his people would abandon Islam and go back to Jahiliyyah. However, the tribe of Aus was also a factor, as they wanted a lenient punishment. They were the smaller of the two Ansari tribes, yet they were immensely important to the Muslims. So the Prophet ﷺ made a compromise that all parties agreed to, including Banu Quraydha. Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh, the leader of Aus, would decide how they would be punished. The punishment given to Banu Quraydha fell well within the norms of the world at the time. It was delivered by a person they accepted, having agreed to whatever arbitration he deemed correct. But what's most interesting is not merely that they agreed to whatever he decided, nor that the punishment fit the crime by the standards of the time, but that the very punishment they received was decreed within their own books. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to your forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace and engage you in battle, lay siege to that fort. When the Lord, your God, delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all men in it. As for the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves, and you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh was chosen by Banu Quraydha as their judge, and he judged them according to their own laws. It had now been 6 years since the Prophet ﷺ and the Muhajirun had left Mecca, and there was no doubt they missed the city dearly. While the idea of returning to their homeland had once seemed far-fetched, a glimmer of hope appeared when the Prophet ﷺ shared a dream. In it, he saw himself in ihram, performing tawaf around the Kaaba and then shaving his head. He took this as a sign that the time had come, and he began preparations to go to Mecca and perform Umrah at the house of Allah. 1,400 Muslims joined him on his pilgrimage, a clear sign that the Muslim community was growing rapidly. But a group of that size would inevitably draw the attention of the Quraysh, so he sent a scout ahead to observe their reaction. The Quraysh, now aware of the Muslims' approach, prepared their armor and their weapons for a fight. The Prophet ﷺ gathered his companions to discuss their next steps, and the decision to continue soon became clear. Their sole intention was to visit the Kaaba, but if the Quraysh wanted to fight, they would defend themselves. Unable to take the usual route, guarded by Khalid ibn Walid and his men, they instead took an unfamiliar passage through a valley of thorns and volcanic rock, continuing their march even as their feet bled. Eventually, they reached the plains of Hudaybiyyah on the outskirts of Mecca, just as night began to fall. But then something strange happened. The Prophet ﷺ's camel suddenly stopped, as though something unseen were preventing it from moving forward. Recognizing this as a sign, just like the miracle stopping the elephant in the time of Abraha, they decided to set up camp and wait for morning. It was there in Hudaybiyyah that the Quraysh soon arrived and the negotiations began. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Indeed, war has damaged the Quraysh and they have been hurt by it. If they wish, we can negotiate and be peaceful. And if they wish, I shall continue to fight them with what Allah has sent me until Allah either grants me victory or this neck of mine is cut off." The Quraysh responded, "By Allah, we will never allow him to enter Mecca, and the Arabs will say that he had the better hand over us." These became the main points of negotiation. The Prophet ﷺ simply wished to perform Umrah and avoid any fighting. The Quraysh, however, had always taken pride in hosting pilgrims, even those from enemy tribes. But this time was different. They refused to let the Muslims enter, even though hosting pilgrims was their sacred duty. They feared what other tribes might say, and they worried that they would be seen as weak and humiliated. The Quraysh sent emissary after emissary, but each time those emissaries returned convinced that the Muslims were in the right. There, the Muslims waited, dressed in ihram, and their sacrificial animals ready to be slaughtered, and their meat given to the poor. Meanwhile, the Quraysh enjoyed the privileges of being the custodians of the house of Allah. How could they justify preventing pilgrims from visiting it, especially during Dhul Qa'dah, one of the 4 sacred months in which fighting was forbidden? The Prophet ﷺ then decided to send Uthman ibn Affan, who was a close relative of Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, now the undisputed leader of Mecca. Uthman made his way into the city, passing a checkpoint where his own cousin was on guard. The cousin offered him protection and personally escorted him through. Uthman then met Abu Sufyan and the other Quraysh leaders. In every round of their talks, the message was the same. Let not the Arabs say that we were forced to let them, the Muslims, in. The real issue was not whether the Muslims could visit the Kaaba. It was that the Quraysh feared appearing weak. But if the Muslims left and returned the following year, the Quraysh could maintain their image of authority and preserve their dignity. Back in the plains of Hudaybiyyah, the Muslims waited anxiously for any sign from Uthman, but hours passed and he did not return, and rumors began to spread that he had been killed. The situation was now critical, and even the Prophet ﷺ grew concerned. The Muslims were tired, hungry, and unprepared for war, but if the Quraysh had killed Uthman, they would need to avenge his death. So a messenger was sent to call all the Muslims. It was time to make an oath of allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ, who was waiting under the shade of a tree.
لقد رضي الله عن المؤمنين إذ يبايعونك تحت الشجرة فعلم ما في قلوبهم فأنزل السكينة عليهم وأثابهم فتحا قريبا.
This became known as the Pledge of the Tree, one of the most difficult oaths the Muslims had ever taken. They had little armor, few supplies, and limited weapons, while the Quraysh were fully armed. Everyone who pledged knew that war would almost certainly mean death, yet they remained steadfast and obedient, ready to give their lives for the sake of Islam. Then, just as tensions were about to boil over, Uthman appeared on the horizon. He was alive and unharmed. The Quraysh hadn't touched him. He had only taken extra time to visit the Muslims who were still trapped and held captive in Mecca. One of the biggest reasons why many people regularly don't read books is because they're often visually bland and boring. This is literally a medium that is visual only, yet authors are often so uncreative and so unimaginative that they never use any imagery to enhance their own stories. So that's why I've put a huge amount of effort into the visuals of this book, the entire history of Islam, so that every page oozes with emotion and so that it adds depth and clarity to the stories. And also so that when people open up the book, they can actually enjoy the beauty of our history, not just in its stories, but in its visuals as well. Beauty is so important, to the point that even the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah is beautiful and that He loves beauty. So I am working with artists and I'm experimenting with all sorts of different colors and art styles and backgrounds and visuals to make sure that every page in this massive book will be absolutely spectacular. This is the most important book of our generation. So it needs to look as important as it truly is. If the presentation isn't done well, then nobody will look past it, even if the writing is worth its weight in gold. So go to my website and pre-order the book now. I will literally write your name into the book. An honor for you, because you were one of the very first people to support this project. Something special only for the people that pre-ordered during this Ramadan only. The funds I get from the pre-orders will then allow me to pay these artists and make sure that every page is extremely visually beautiful while also being easy to read. So go to my website now and pre-order the book. And may Allah fill your life with beauty. Ameen. The Quraysh now sent their final emissary, Suhail ibn Amr, one of their greatest speakers and negotiators. What made his role especially striking was his long and complicated history with Islam. Years earlier, he had been taken to the Prophet ﷺ's masjid in Medina as a captive from the Battle of Badr, and both of his sons had since embraced Islam. His eldest son, Abdullah, at first kept his Islam secret and even joined his father and the Quraysh in marching to fight the Muslims at Badr. But once their camp was set up on the battlefield, Abdullah slipped away, rode across to the Muslim side, and gave his oath of allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ. This was a huge embarrassment for Suhail, and the Quraysh mocked and humiliated him for it. Now his other son, Abu Jandal, had also become Muslim, but to prevent another humiliation, Suhail had him chained up and locked in a dungeon. For 4.5 years, Abu Jandal remained imprisoned. By now, he knew how to break free from the chains and escape the dungeon, but he faced a deeper problem. He was still trapped within Mecca. Crossing the harsh desert to Medina alone would be nearly impossible. Then he heard that the Muslims were camped just outside the city at Hudaybiyyah. He realized that this may be his only chance. Breaking free of his shackles, he ran through the streets and made his way to Hudaybiyyah. Meanwhile, Suhail sat with the Prophet ﷺ negotiating a treaty. The two sides agreed that the Muslims would perform Umrah, but not this year, rather the next. They also agreed on a 10-year truce, during which neither side would fight the other, and both could form alliances with any tribe they chose. But the most difficult clauses concerned runaways and converts. If someone from Medina left Islam and returned to paganism, he could stay in Mecca and would not be sent back. But if a pagan from Mecca converted to Islam, he would not be allowed to move to Medina, and the Prophet ﷺ would have to send him back. Just as this final condition was being finalized, Abu Jandal came running to the Prophet ﷺ, his wrists still in chains and the marks of torture covering his back. He pleaded with the Prophet ﷺ to save him and not leave him in Mecca to face another torture. But this was exactly the situation Suhail had anticipated, and here was his own son proving the point. The Prophet ﷺ pleaded with Suhail to make an exception for Abu Jandal, but Suhail refused. He would not allow the Muslims to take his son. And to calm the tension, however, he promised to stop the torture and to keep Abu Jandal safe. The Treaty of Hudaybiyyah was signed and ratified, and it was hung on the walls of the Kaaba. Though Abu Jandal was forced to return to Mecca, the Muslims could now breathe a sigh of relief. The Quraysh would no longer wage war against them. This was a tremendous victory for Islam. Across Arabia, tribes began to see the Muslims as a legitimate political entity, opening the doors to trade agreements and encouraging merchants to visit the markets of Medina. Although some Muslims were saddened by the seemingly unfavorable terms, Allah declared it a great triumph. The Muslims did not know it yet, but this treaty would soon completely transform their situation. And to mark the occasion, Allah revealed Surah Al-Fath.
إنا فتحنا لك فتحا مبينا ليغفر لك الله ما تقدم من ذنبك وما تأخر ويتم نعمته عليك ويهديك صراطا مستقيما وينصرك الله نصرا عزيزا.
The situation for Abu Jandal was now dire. Taken back to Mecca and forced again into captivity, he had no way to join the Muslims in Medina. Even if he somehow escaped, the conditions of the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah required that he be sent back. But Abu Jandal was not the only one affected by this clause. Abu Basir was the first person to attempt the hijrah from Mecca to Medina after the treaty had been signed. Naively, he thought that the Muslims would not strictly enforce it, but when the Meccans sent 2 men to retrieve him, the Prophet ﷺ honored the treaty and allowed them to take Abu Basir away. On the journey back to Mecca, Abu Basir seized the opportunity. He took the sword of one of his captors and killed him. The other fled, and Abu Basir escaped. He settled along the coast of the Red Sea near the area of Jeddah, and before long Abu Jandal and other Muslims from Mecca joined him. Together, they formed a small community of about 80 men. From there, they began attacking Meccan trade routes, sustaining themselves through ambushes and guerrilla raids on enemy caravans. The Meccans could not defend against these sudden attacks, and after a year or two of heavy losses, they finally appealed to the Prophet ﷺ and begged them to bring these men under his protection. The Prophet ﷺ sent Abu Basir a letter granting him permission to migrate to Medina, but Abu Basir, having fallen ill or being wounded, died clutching the Prophet's letter in his final moments. Abu Jandal and the rest of the group then made their way to Medina. After the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah was signed, the main threat to Medina and the Muslims was neutralized. This freed the Muslim army to focus on another major danger, the openly hostile tribe of Banu Nadir in the nearby land of Khaybar. The people of Banu Nadir had instigated the battle of Khandaq and persuaded Banu Quraydha to betray their treaty. So the Prophet ﷺ began preparations for battle and called on all Muslims who were willing to join him. Khaybar was not a single city, but it was a cluster of citadels and fortresses, each isolated from the others. When the Muslims arrived, they besieged the largest fortress first. Its people surrendered and made a treaty with the Prophet ﷺ, and he left them unharmed. He then advanced on the remaining fortresses, capturing them one by one until all of Khaybar submitted. Conditions of surrender were then negotiated. The people of Banu Nadir and the rest of Khaybar would not be harmed. They could remain on their lands and continue working on it. They would hand over their gold, silver, weapons, and armor, and they would give 50% of their annual produce to the Muslims. It was an extremely lenient treaty, considering that just a year earlier they had nearly annihilated the Muslims at the Battle of Khandaq. Yet it secured a vital source of wealth for the Muslims, enabling the Muslims to strengthen their economy and rapidly transform their city into a powerful and influential state. It was a joyous moment for the Muslims, a time of ease and relief after so many years of hardship. And yet, as they celebrated their victory at Khaybar, a caravan arrived from Africa carrying Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, the brother of Ali, and the rest of the Muslims who had migrated to Abyssinia. The Muslims of Abyssinia had finally returned. Back in Mecca, during the 6th year of the da'wah, Allah revealed a strange set of ayat in the Quran.
ألف لام ميم غلبت الروم في أدنى الأرض وهم من بعد غلبهم سيغلبون في بضع سنين لله الأمر من قبل ومن بعد ويومئذ يفرح المؤمنون بنصر الله ينصر من يشاء وهو العزيز الرحيم.
At the time these ayat were revealed, the Persians had just gained a monumental victory over the Romans. For the first time in more than 600 years of conflict, the Persian armies reached the very gates of Constantinople, threatening to seize the capital and bring down the Roman Empire itself. This was only the latest in a long series of Persian triumphs. When Abraha and his elephants were destroyed by the birds that guarded Mecca, the Persians exploited the weakened region and invaded Yemen. They then went on to conquer Syria, sweeping through the Levant, where they found the Jewish communities long expelled from Jerusalem. These Jewish groups joined them and launched an uprising against Rome. For the first time since the Bar Kokhba rebellion, Jews re-entered Jerusalem as victors, having aided the Persian forces. Next came the Persian conquest of Egypt, until their power nearly encircled the entire Arabian Peninsula. Observing these Persian advances, the Prophet ﷺ recognized them as the greatest potential threat to the survival of Islam. This understanding explains why the Prophet ﷺ declined the protection of Banu Shayban ibn Tha'laba, who admitted they could defend him against Arab foes, but not against the Persians. By contrast, when Aus and Khazraj pledged to fight every enemy, he chose them as the helpers, the Ansar of Islam, and established Medina as the Muslim community's home. It is also why he sent a group of Muslims to seek refuge in Abyssinia, a strategic backup in case Persia ever invaded Arabia. Abyssinia remained one of the few regions the Persians never ruled, nor would they ever conquer. There, under the rule of the Najashi of Aksum, the Muslim refugees would find kindness and safety, ensuring their community's survival. The Prophet's foresight proved true. Even when some of the Najashi's ministers wanted to expel the Muslims and return them to the Quraysh, the kingdom stood firm in their defense. The Najashi and his ministers were well versed in Christian scripture, but when Ja'far ibn Abi Talib recited Surah Maryam to the Najashi, the king was so moved that he said, "By God, what you have just said does not exceed what Jesus Christ said by this much of a branch." This simple statement stirred suspicion among Najashi's ministers, who began to wonder whether they had secretly embraced Islam. That night, the Najashi summoned Ja'far ibn Abi Talib in secret and asked him to teach him more about the faith. From that meeting, the Najashi took his shahada, quietly becoming a Muslim. Knowing his ministers would revolt if they discovered the truth, he asked Ja'far to write down some Quranic verses on parchment and fold them. The Najashi then placed these writings in the inner pocket of his garments, covering them over his chest. The next morning, when he met with the ministers, he asked them what troubled them. They said that they suspected he had left their religion. The Najashi then asked what they believed, and they replied with the doctrine of the Trinity and that Isa alayhi salam was the Son of Allah. Pointing to his heart, the Najashi said, "This is what I believe." Unbeknownst to them, he was pointing at the Quran hidden inside his thobe. Still, whispers persisted, and some ministers conspired to replace him with his cousin. A civil war then broke out and was fought along the banks of a river. The Muslim settlement in Aksum happened to be on the opposite bank of that river, so they sent Zubair ibn al-Awwam across to see who was winning. That day, the Muslims prayed with the utmost earnestness, and Allah answered their du'as, granting victory to the Najashi. The dispute ended with the Najashi still in power, but many ministers blamed the Muslims for the conflict. They urged him to expel the Muslims, but he refused. They then instead insisted that the Muslims must remain isolated in their settlements and not mix with the wider society. Thus, the Muslims lived in seclusion, unable to spread Islam further in the region. The Najashi alone became the only Aksumite Muslim, and when he eventually passed away, the Prophet ﷺ performed a janazah prayer for him from Medina. Meanwhile, just as Surah Al-Rum had predicted, the Persians were soon defeated. 9 years after the revelation of those verses, around the second year after the Hijrah, the Romans rallied, drove the Persians back, and completely turned the tide of war. This precise prediction of Roman victory within 10 years was a clear prophecy from the Quran. The Muslims, they rejoiced at that very time, for as the Romans triumphed over the Persians, the Muslims themselves were victorious against the Quraysh at Badr. With the Persian threat contained and later the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah signed, the Prophet ﷺ sent a letter to the Muslims in Aksum inviting them to return back home. They arrived back in the 7th year after Hijrah, on the very day the Muslims conquered Khaybar. Though they had missed many events and battles, the Prophet ﷺ honored them as the people of 2 Hijras, one to Abyssinia and one to Medina. It was as though Allah had delayed the previous year's Umrah so that these devoted Muslims could return and share in the community's triumph. 1 year after signing the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah, about 2,000 Muslims prepared and set out for Mecca. They brought their armor and their weapons in case the Quraysh betrayed them, but they left these outside the city under the guard of 200 soldiers. When the Muslims entered Mecca, most of the Quraysh either stayed inside their homes or left the city altogether. For those, however, who remained to watch, the sight was unforgettable. The Muslims, now vast in number, running with the strength and energy around the Kaaba, performed tawaf in quick, determined circuits while loudly chanting the talbiyah. "Here I am, my Lord, here I am. Here I am, you have no partner. Here I am, praise, grace, and the kingdom is for you. You have no partner. Seeing the energy and fervor of their belief had a deep effect on the Meccans. Not only did it disprove the rumors that the Muslims were weak, but some among the Quraysh began to predict that Islam would ultimately prevail and spread across the entire Arabian Peninsula. Others started to wonder, if the Muslims were so certain of their faith, perhaps there was truth in it after all. When Amr ibn al-As saw the Muslims performing their Umrah, he realized that the city of Mecca would eventually fall to them. So he began packing his bags and he set off for Africa, hoping to find refuge in the kingdom of the Najashi. Ironically, the roles were now reversed. Amr had once tried to convince the Najashi not to allow the Muslims to settle in this land, yet now he stood before the same king, asking for permission to settle there, just as the Muslims had done years before. But as Amr arrived in Abyssinia, a messenger from the Prophet ﷺ happened to arrive at the same time. While speaking with the Najashi about his own settlement, Amr went as far as to request permission to kill this messenger. At that, the Najashi became enraged and struck his nose in a gesture of utter disgust. The Najashi said, "Do you wish me to deliver into your hands the envoy of one of whom the great spirit Jibreel descends upon? Oh, Amr, woe to you. Obey me in this regard and follow this man, the Prophet ﷺ, for this man is upon the truth. And for sure he will be victorious over his enemies, just like Musa was victorious over Fir'aun." This reaction surprised Amr and shook him to his core. If even the great Najashi of Abyssinia believed in the Prophet ﷺ, perhaps he had been wrong about Islam all along. Determined to reconsider, Amr returned to Mecca. But just as he entered the city, he met Khalid ibn al-Walid and Uthman ibn Talha, two noblemen of the Quraysh who were themselves setting out on a journey to Medina. Khalid had earlier received a letter from his brother who had already embraced Islam back when he had come for the Umrah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. As to what follows, I have not seen anything stranger than you running away from Islam. For how long will you oppose Islam? And the Prophet ﷺ asked me about you when he came to Mecca. He said, "Where is Khalid?" And I responded, "Allah will bring him." The Prophet ﷺ said, "It is not befitting that someone like him neglects Islam. If he were to put his talents and energy with us against the mushrikun, it would be better for him and we would give him honor. So my dear brother, make up for what you have already passed, because many opportunities have passed you by. Wassalam." Khalid had long sensed that Allah was protecting the Prophet ﷺ. For every time he fought against the Muslims, victory slipped from his grasp. At Uhud, he led the cavalry that killed the archers and struck the Muslims from behind. Yet still, the Prophet ﷺ escaped defeat. At Khandaq, Khalid was one of the few who managed to cross the trench and even led a small group into Medina itself. But he was quickly surrounded by the Muslims and forced to retreat. Again, victory eluded him. At Hudaybiyyah, he plotted an ambush on the Muslims as they went to Mecca. Yet the Prophet ﷺ took a sudden detour through a valley of thorns and volcanic rock. And once more, Allah prevented Khalid from success. Now, with a letter from his brother, who had already embraced Islam, and knowing that the Prophet ﷺ was asking about him, Khalid resolved to travel to Medina and accept Islam. He spoke with his friend Uthman ibn Talha. Together they set out, meeting Amr ibn al-As on the road just as they were leaving Mecca. This would be the final group of converts to make the hijrah to Medina, and each would receive a great honor in Islam. Amr ibn al-As would go down as the one to conquer Egypt and bring it into Islam. Khalid ibn al-Walid would lead the campaigns that conquered Syria and Palestine, earning him the title Sword of Allah. Uthman ibn Talha would be entrusted with the keys of the Kaaba after the Muslims conquered Mecca, a responsibility that remains with his descendants even till this day. One of the reasons that I'm writing this book, The Entire History of Islam, is because it's never been done before. Never has a book covered the entire history of this ummah, from Brazil and the Caribbean in the West to the Muslim kingdoms in China and the Philippines and Vietnam. Never has a book explained what happened to the Sahaba of Isa alayhi salam, or who the people of the ditch were from Surah Al-Buruj, or what happened to the Injil after Isa alayhi salam was taken up by Allah, or how Isa alayhi salam had a Khalifa after he left. These make up only a small fraction of the book that I'm writing, a collection of our entire history, 1,000 pages long. And it's because of how big and how extensive it is, I need to hire historians and scholars to both help me in my research and to correct me when I make mistakes. That's why I'm opening up pre-orders now, so that I can use the money to fund the completion of this book, a book that will be the most important of our generation. So go to my website now and pre-order the book. And if you pre-order the book during this Ramadan only, I will literally write your name into the book so that the future generations know and recognize that it was you who was the reason that this book could even exist in the first place. May Allah give your name a legacy that this ummah will never forget. Ameen. As Medina developed into a full-fledged Muslim state, the Prophet ﷺ began sending diplomatic letters to neighboring kingdoms and empires. Each letter was concise and direct, inviting rulers and their nations to Islam. He addressed each leader with proper honor and titles. Some accepted his invitation, while others rejected it. Within the Arabian Peninsula, the Ghassanids in the north and the people of Al-Yamama in Central Arabia initially refused to convert. But the people of Bahrain and Oman accepted Islam and joined the Muslim Ummah. Then a letter was sent to Cyrus of Alexandria, also known in Arabic as Al-Muqawqis, the leader of the Coptic Christians in Egypt, which was then a Persian vassal state. He politely declined Islam, but responded with gifts for the Prophet ﷺ. And because of this courteousness, Allah preserved his kingdom for a time until the Muslims eventually conquered it. The letter that was sent to Khusraw II, the Persian king of kings, met a harsher reception. Enraged, Khusraw tore the Prophet's letter to pieces, and so in turn, Allah would soon tear apart his kingdom. Khusraw then wrote to Badan, his governor in Yemen, ordering him to investigate the Prophet and, if possible, bring him back to Persia. Badan then sent 2 agents to Medina who pretended they were merely delivering a letter. When they met the Prophet ﷺ, he told them to return the next day. When they did, the Prophet ﷺ told them, "Return to your master and tell him that Allah has killed Khusraw. His own son has now taken the throne." Shocked, the 2 agents hurried back to Yemen, but by the time they arrived, news had already reached Badan. A coup had indeed taken place exactly as the Prophet ﷺ had foretold, and Khusraw II was now dead, and his son now ruled. Not long after the Prophet ﷺ's own passing, the once mighty Persian Empire itself would soon collapse and come under Muslim rule. Finally, a letter was sent to the Roman Emperor Heraclius, the Caesar of Byzantium. At that time, Heraclius was visiting Jerusalem, having recently retaken it from the Persians. When he received the Prophet ﷺ's letter, he summoned Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, leader of the Quraysh, who happened to be traveling through Syria with a caravan. Like the Najashi of Aksum, Heraclius was a learned Christian familiar with the signs of prophecy. He brought Abu Sufyan to the front and seated the members of his caravan behind him, instructing them to signal silently if Abu Sufyan lied. Then the interrogation began. Heraclius asked, "What is his family status among you?" He replied, "He belongs to a noble family among us." Heraclius further asked, "Has anyone among you ever claimed the same, that is, to be a prophet before him?" Abu Sufyan replied, "No." He said, "Was any one of your ancestors a king?" He replied, "No." Heraclius asked, "Do the nobles or the poor follow him?" He replied, "It is the poor who follow him." He asked, "Are his followers increasing or decreasing day by day?" He replied, "They are increasing." He then asked, "Does anyone who embraces his religion become displeased and renounce it afterwards?" He said, "No." Heraclius then said, have you ever accused him of lying before he claimed prophethood? He said, no. He said, does he ever break his promises? He replied, no, but we are at a truce with him and we do not know what he will do in the future. Heraclius asked, have you ever fought wars with him? He replied, yes. He said, what was the outcome of those battles? He replied, sometimes he was victorious and sometimes we were. Heraclius then asked, what does he command you to do? He said, he tells us to worship Allah alone and not to worship anything alongside him. He orders us to renounce all that our ancestors practiced, to pray, to speak the truth, to be chaste, and to keep good relations with our family. Then Heraclius told his translator to convey this. I asked you about his family, and you said he belonged to a noble family. Indeed, all prophets came from noble families among their people. I asked you if anyone else had claimed prophethood, and you said no. Had you said yes, I would have thought that he was imitating someone earlier. I asked if any of his ancestors was a king, and you said no. Had you said yes, I would have thought he sought to regain his ancestors' kingdom. I asked whether he was known to lie before, and you said no. So how could someone who never lies about people suddenly lie about Allah? I asked you whether the rich or the poor follow him, and you said, the poor. All prophets have been followed by this very class. I asked whether his followers increase or decrease, and you said they increase. Such is the way of true faith until it is complete. I asked whether anyone, after embracing his religion, became displeased and abandoned it. You said no, and indeed that is a sign of true faith when its sweetness enters the heart. I asked whether he betrays, and you said no. Prophets never betray. I asked what he commands you to do, and you said he tells you to worship Allah alone, not to worship idols, to pray, to speak the truth, and to be chaste. If what you say is true, he will soon occupy the ground beneath my feet. I knew from the scriptures that he was to appear, but I did not know he would be appearing from among you. If I could reach him, I would go to meet him, and if I were with him, I would wash his feet. Abu Sufyan later said, when Heraclius finished his speech and read the letter, there was a great uproar in the royal courtroom, and we were turned out. I then told my companions the affair of Ibn Abi Kabsha, one of the nicknames he gave the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, had become so prominent that even the king of the Byzantines fears him. At that moment, I began to feel certain that he would soon become the victor. These were the most famous letters of the Prophet ﷺ, but he sent many others as well. Some kings embraced Islam in response while others rejected it. Yet one letter in particular never reached the kingdom for which it was intended. And because of that incident, a new war broke out, and some of the Prophet's closest companions were martyred in battle far away in a land near the borders of Rome. In the 8th year after Hijrah, the Prophet ﷺ sent a messenger to Basra in Syria with a letter inviting the king to Islam. On his journey, the messenger passed through the kingdom of Ghassanids, where he was kidnapped and tortured. Although harming diplomats is forbidden under every code of conduct, the Ghassanids violated the sacred law and they eventually killed him. This was an act of war. When the Prophet ﷺ heard the news, he gathered a large army and appointed 3 of his closest companions as commanders in succession. Zayd ibn Haritha, his adopted son, who would lead first. If Zayd fell, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, the brother of Ali, would take command. And if Ja'far also fell, Abdullah ibn Ruwayha would be the next leader. If all 3 were killed, then the Muslims would choose a commander from among themselves. For a month, the Muslim army marched north through the Arabian desert towards the Ghassanids to avenge their slain envoy. But as soon as the Ghassanids heard of their approaching force, they sent urgent calls to their allies and assembled a massive army to intercept the Muslims. The Ghassanids, a powerful Christian kingdom allied with the Romans, guarded Byzantine borders from both the Arabs and the Persians. Although Heraclius himself recognized signs of Muhammad's prophethood, the Roman Empire was vast, with many independent generals and armies. One of those Roman contingents joined the Ghassanids forming a combined force. When the Muslims finally reached the plains of Mutah, they saw the Ghassanid Roman army outnumbering them at least 3-1. Understandably, the Muslims grew anxious. Sensing their fear, Zayd ibn Haritha sought the army's counsel. It was then that Abdullah ibn Ruwayha rose and he declared, "O my people, what you are scared of is exactly what you're after. You're scared of dying, but isn't that why we're here? To die a shaheed, isn't that the ultimate goal? What is the matter with us? Allah will bless us with one of two things, either victory or shahada. And we know that Allah does not help us through quantity or weapons, but rather through our Islam that He has blessed us with. So let us go forth and face one of the two inevitable realities." With that, the army was convinced and they charged forward at the enemy, embracing death with open hearts. Zayd ibn Haritha led the way, carrying the army's banner, the flag he used to guide and rally the soldiers in battle. He was quickly struck down and the banner fell, and Ja'far ibn Abi Talib seized it and plunged back into the fight. His arm was then cut off, and so he gripped the banner with his left. When his left arm was severed, he then clutched the flag in his chest between the stumps of his arms, and eventually he too was cut down. Later, when the battle ended, 90 wounds were counted on his body. Abdullah ibn Ruwayha then took the banner, and for a brief moment he hesitated, but he conquered his own soul and he leapt forward, dying a shaheed. All three appointed commanders fallen, the Muslims chose Khalid ibn Walid to lead them. Taking the banner, Khalid skillfully organized a fighting withdrawal, preserving the army so that they could regroup and fight the Romans another day. Remarkably, few Muslims were killed, and on the return march they even captured some spoils of war after raiding a Ghassanid village. Their survival against the massive Roman Ghassanid force became a story of courage that spread all across Arabia, lifting Muslim morale despite the tactical setback. Still, the Prophet ﷺ mourned deeply. The loss of 3 of his dearest companions brought profound grief to him and to the entire community of Medina. The script of this video was based on one of the chapters of my new upcoming book, The Entire History of Islam. An absolutely massive book dedicated to telling the entire story of our ummah. From the lost Muslim kingdoms of Spain and France to the great sultanates of Vietnam and the Philippines and Russia. This is our entire history, a compilation that has never been done before in the entire history of our ummah. This is the most important book of this generation. So go to my website now and pre-order the book. I will literally write your name into the book as an honor for you, so that generations from now, people will read this book and know that it was you. You were the reason that this book could even be printed in the first place. So go to my website and pre-order now, and may Allah accept you as a co-author to the most important book of our generation. Ameen.